An obvious thing when it comes down to racists is how pathetic they actually are. Their arguments are outdated, refuted, debunked, and they no longer work. With the fall of religion, the collapse of Christianity in particular, you have many people who aren't even religious. And what I mean by that is, at least in the past, when religion had influence, you could understand certain, incitement from a religious perspective, which could support an ignorance due to certain interpretations of the Bible. People could accept certain aspects of it as being supportive of a white supremacist belief, or alternatively with other groups, a black supremacist belief or whatever. But now you have secular racist hatred, and really I can't see how it stands up at all unless a person takes it in an almost religious manner, where it becomes a question of faith and supporting a faith as opposed to actually dealing with real world issues. You can understand how people take on a belief system and accept certain things to do with that belief, and if they don't think beyond their limitations, beyond their simplistic view, then they consider a thing to be true, not merely in a simplistic sense, but to be, the truth. They accept things as being utterly true despite the lack of evidence, because they're convinced by arguments and so-called, things that they would call evidence, but really are in fact bad evidence. Stuff that's not really evidential of their claims of, white supremacism or any other form of supremacism. There are many different kinds, and yet they would say these things are evidence. And rather than dealing with their own ignorance and their own inability to comprehend the greater nuances of, reality as it is, they call their opposition close-minded. Liberals are this. If you mention that you're a person who's liberal, or social democrat, or whatever the case may be, they presume certain things about you. They assert certain things about your being, the way in which you act, the way in which you think. Oh, you can't say that, that's offensive. Sorry, dickhole. That's not the way I think. But you said you were, but I'm not a cultist, unlike you. But you... No. There isn't the great conformity when it comes down to the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, even the Green Party. And of course UKIP as well. There's not this massive conformity to stick to certain perspectives in a fanatical manner, where if you speak your mind and disagree with the policies, you'll be asked to leave or thrown out. There isn't quite that thing going on. Unless you come out as a racist, of course. In which case, with any party, within reason, you get thrown out. Unless it's the BNP, in which case you get promoted. But either way, you have this setup where you cannot truly get on in mainstream, relatively centre ground politics if you're a bigot. Whether it's a racial bigot, a cultural bigot, a nationalistic bigot, whatever kind of bigot, you're not going to get far with your prejudices. So, unless you live in a really prejudicial society. And there are ways of making prejudice work for you, but that's not usually in the extreme case. And racial prejudice isn't helpful at all. And it doesn't really take off. It doesn't really show itself to be popular because people want to reject that kind of bullshit because it does not work in the real world. So really trying to say that one group is a group thinks like, they are all like, that kind of view, that kind of policy is bullshit. Now don't get me wrong, there are people who support racist views and ideas who aren't completely fucked up in the head. That's true, there are nuances even within the racist organisations out there. But there is a greater level of conformity, especially with a political party or an activist group, towards certain, very restricted goals and ideas, making it unlike the mainstream political apparatus, the mainstream political point of view, political parties, activist groups, lobbying groups, etc. Very different, far more restricted, far more controlling. And there are controls and limitations on the left, that's true, and let's not joke around, Labour, Greens, Liberals, hardly the left wing. Now when we say left and we talk about conformity, we're talking about the extreme far, far left. And even then, you have the ability to question. You have the ability to inquire. Unless we're talking about the kind of formation of a group, which you can, perfectly well leave and join a more down-to-earth group. We're talking about some kind of fanatical group like, some kind of communist party. Even then, they allow questions and discussion. Even then, hard questions are asked. But you don't see that kind of thing with racist groups. Not anywhere near as much, at the very least. Prejudicial groups and groups which are against certain cultures and religions, they're more open. But when it comes down to the hardcore racists, the National Front type of people, the BNP is the more publicly accepted face, but even then, far beyond the fringe. Groups like that, you have incredible limitations. And this is why groups on the far right, not only are they more limited, but they're also more fractured. So, I disagree with that particular policy. Does the policy of the party, the group, the activist group, or the organisation, does that change? Does that adapt? Usually not. Instead, they simply start a new group. So there are quite literally hundreds of different groups all across the UK, and there are the better known ones and the lesser known ones. And most of them aren't really proper organisations. They're a group of people who agree on a certain thing and cooperate either online or in some kind of more public manner, and really achieve very little. And of course many people have cross-group loyalties. They'll be part of the EDL and part of, say, UKIP as well, or part of the National Front and part of the BNP. So there can be massive crossovers there. So that can be a problem as well. So people can mix and match to a degree, but even so, certain key elements of racist beliefs and racist groups are far more limiting, far more controlling than, say, a person who is a Marxist. I mean, there are some key prominent speakers who are Marxists, certain philosophers, whether they relate to universities or their lecturers, or whether they're key political individuals who discuss key issues. Whatever the case may be, there is still room to disagree. A person may agree with the ideas of, say, George Galloway, but then, because of some of his ideas being wrong, they don't throw out the entire, the baby with the bathwater. The same can be said of Noam Chomsky and some of his ideas and some of his points. You can mix and match. You can do that. With the right wing, far harder to actually do. Far harder. Although many people would take the words of, what was his name? Enoch Powell, that's the one. Enoch Powell, he basically said that there would be considerable problems between different groups, different races basically, different cultures coming together in the UK. And he was a Tory. But basically, he has been used time and time again by these racists to try and say that, oh look, it's happening. Now his prediction failed, and failed epically. A little bit of intercultural violence is hardly a failure of multiculturalism, is it? Oh, you might disagree. Well, what's multiculturalism? It's simply having lots of cultures and defending the rights of democracy. You have democratic freedoms to believe in different beliefs. It says nothing about one belief having dominance over another, because it's multicultural. So it's not about Islam having too much of a say, or Christianity getting back its power. No. That's bullshit. And of course, the idea that, oh well, look at terrorism, look at Muslim terrorism, in a way Enoch was correct. Well, no, he wasn't. He wasn't correct at all. A handful of people who've gone towards terrorism in the UK is hardly a question of, well, rivers of blood in the streets, is it? The fact that Jamaican culture, since, you know, the Jamaicans came over in their droves to fill industrial positions in the 1950s, you know, the 1960s, and, you know, other groups as well, those from Pakistan and India and Bangladesh and other parts of the world. The fact that they've integrated so well, and we have a diverse culture with diverse music and ideas, political process, interaction, and yet people still are held back because some groups are more about preserving their traditions rather than mixing together and sort of like, well, being a cordial in water, basically. They don't want to integrate utterly because they want to hold on to parts of their culture. And I'm not just talking about Islam, I'm also talking about the way in which the Sikhs and their tradition to do with turbans. And many people have put aside the traditions of the turban, but they've been trying to revive that because it's an important cultural aspect to them. And within their own community, they've been trying to encourage the practice again and the proper way of doing the turban. So there are different ways of having traditionalism and revivalism of those traditions and ideas. But either way, these things are not prejudicial, they're not racist, and it's worth saying that we stand for certain rights and for individuality as well. So yes, you have the right to believe certain practices. Doesn't mean you can do them all, because we live in a society of rules and ideas.